What's cooking, everybody? Dave Altizer here with Kinotika. Today we are talking about the Sony a7R III for video purposes only. Now, it's no secret that Sony markets this camera and ultimately designed this camera for stills photographers, but this camera really packs a punch when it comes to video. Now, we're splitting this video up into 3 different parts. I actually shot 3 different scenarios. One was a mini documentary type narrative kind of thing. The second was a wedding film that I shot with my friend Jeffrey Holland and his company Full Frame Cinema. And lastly is a vlogger type scenario. So before we start off with the 3 different sections, let's just go over the baseline specs of this camera and what makes it so great for video. First off, it's a full frame sensor that shoots 4K and has good autofocus. Yeah. You get S-Log 3 now with the a7R III, which is a welcome addition. You also get the ability to shoot in 120 frames per second at 1080 with full autofocus, mind you, and no crop. Also, a lot of people have talked about this already, but the battery life on this camera is fabulous. The customizability that you can have with this camera is amazing. You can map all the features that you want onto buttons. The My Menu section is now a welcome addition. You can create your own menu structure in the order that you want. You can sort it however you want. It really solves a lot of the problems and the headaches that a lot of us have had with Sony cameras in the past when it comes to usability. There's 2 4K modes on this camera. Obviously the full frame mode, but then you also get the ability to crop into Super 35 mode, which is an APS-C crop. Having the ability to go back and forth and not lose resolution is great. The Super 35 mode actually is a little bit sharper, but it's not as good in low light as the full frame. Full frame is better in low light, but it's not as sharp. Ultimately, at the end of the day, people aren't gonna see a difference between the two. The 4K mode and full frame has finally gotten acceptable, and it's much better than the a7R II was. So let's get straight into talking about the shoot that I did. We shot a mini documentary about my friend Anthony Lena, who is a balloon sculptor. He has been doing balloon art since he was 14 years old, and I really wanted to tell his story using this camera. I shot it in a traditional way as I normally would for a mini doc. The camera was on a tripod during the interview. I had my Contax Zeiss 28mm manual focus lens on the camera. It looked really sharp. I had some nice depth of field, and I really liked the way that lens looked compared to the Sony lens. It just had a little bit more character. So I wanted to use that lens for the sit-down interview, but I didn't want to change lenses. It would cause the interview to get slow, and I'd have to stop the process and Anthony would get thrown off. Obviously, when you're shooting 4K and you're delivering in 1080, you can crop into the 4K and that helps, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to keep it 4K all the way through. So this camera is really great for that because using the 28mm prime that I had on the camera, I was able to get essentially 2 focal lengths, 28mm in full frame, 4K, and then I would crop into Super 35 mode, and now I've got essentially like a 40mm, 45mm equivalent. I would just switch it back and forth when we would pause or anytime I would ask him a question. And it's really neat to have the ability to do that and not lose any resolution. So we're still finishing up the interview right now, but I've been shooting on the Sony a7R III this entire time with 1 battery. We've been doing an interview for about an hour and a half, and I still have 51% battery life left shooting 4K. That is a huge improvement. I went from the manual lens in the sit-down interview to the 24-105 in full autofocus mode. The image stabilization was fabulous. I was able to just hold it completely still and it looked like a monopod or a shoulder cam. Both the lens and the sensor are working together to stabilize the footage, and it looked rock solid. I also enabled the touchscreen and used the spot focusing mode every once in a while to do rack focusing, and it looked great. The user interface isn't as nice as the Canon UI. I really like how the Canon UI, you just touch an object and it tracks it. This doesn't do that. It's just a spot that you touch and then it stays locked on that spot. The face tracking does automatically trigger if you have face tracking enabled. For most of the time, I would just shoot in wide focusing mode with the face tracking on, and it would just lock on to Anthony's face. When I would zoom in on his hands or different things like that, in the wide focusing mode, it would just kind of focus on whatever was closest to the camera, and it did a really good job. It looked great. The next scenario I used this camera in for video was a wedding film that I shot with my friend Jeffrey Holland in Full Frame Cinema. I've been working with Jeffrey for over a decade, and we've shot literally hundreds of weddings together, so it's always a lot of fun. Jeffrey completely switched from Canon to Sony over a year ago, and he really has enjoyed it and he really likes it. And so I was real excited to see how Jeffrey, who already was a Sony fan, would enjoy this camera. He immediately loved it. He loved the handling of it, the buttons, and in particular the sunny weather mode. Being able to shoot outdoors with a bright screen when you hit record in 4K was completely a huge step in the right direction. We put this camera on his gimbal, the Lettuce Helix Jr. The rolling shutter performance was fabulous in Super 35 mode. We shot 4K pretty much all day with the exception of the ceremony. We had it on autofocus with face tracking, and it was working great. The camera performed really well, and Jeffrey was real impressed, and so was I. During the reception, I also did an ISO test comparing the a7R III in Super 35 mode to the a7S II. The full frame mode in the a7R is slightly better at low light, but it's not tremendously better. So this is a pretty fair comparison between the two cameras. Obviously the a7S II is better, but the a7R III is not terrible either. In fact, it's roughly what a 6300 or 6500 performance would be. And last but not least, the vlogging type setup. It's very cold out right now. It's 24 degrees outside, but I'm doing this for the sake of this review. So in a moment like this where I'm just setting the camera down on a thing with a GorillaPod, I could pull out my phone and sync it to the app. So I'm gonna do that right now.
5 minutes later.
Okay, so after about, I don't know, 5 minutes of me standing here fiddling with my phone, I finally got the Wi-Fi to connect, and I have the iPhone app running. I've had this camera on face tracking the whole time, and hopefully you can see how it's performing. It looks good on my phone over here off to the side. And so that hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of what the face tracking looks like on this camera. So now let's see what the steady shot looks like handheld shooting selfie mode. So now let's look at the steady shot. This is with the steady shot turned on. I'm at 24 millimeters in full frame mode. And now this is with steady shot and optical image stabilization turned off. Should you wait for the S3 or just buy this now? I think if you have the money, then do it. Make the switch, get this camera. If the S3 comes out and it's really something that you want and it makes more sense for you, then sell the camera on eBay and buy the S3. Even if the S3 comes out and it's better for video, the resale value of the R3 is probably still gonna be really high on eBay just because photographers are mostly buying it. We got lots of videos coming out this month. I'm going to Alaska next week and we're gonna be doing some video reviews there. So make sure to stay tuned, subscribe, please subscribe, it means a lot. Let me know if you have any questions about this camera in the comment section below. Give us a thumbs up if you liked it. I'm Dave Altizer. See you next time. I'm Papa John's. Better ingredients, better pizza, Papa John's.